Morning. Hi, Bill. Hi, Mom.
Lots of front row familiar faces. They're
It's
going to
good.
throw me
It's
off
good.
this whole time.
Um, so I'm Mara Gladstone. I'm a curator at the Palm Springs Art Museum here in the desert, and I am so delighted to introduce Josh Kun, who's one of the most multi-hyphenate cultural thinkers I've had the pleasure to meet. Josh's work focuses on the arts and politics of cultural connection, with an emphasis on popular music, sound, globalization, US Mexico borders, and Los Angeles. He's a super accomplished author, having worked in both scholarly and popular contexts as a journalist and a critic. He's authored and edited at least 10 award winning books. He's a prolific curator, having organized exhibitions and music interventions for the Getty's Pacific Standard Time Project, the California African American Museum. He was a commissioned artist for SF MoMA, and he's collaborated with myriad artists, authors, musicians, museums, libraries, cultural institutions throughout California and the United States. And in his free time, uh, Josh is the director of the School of Communication and chair in cross-cultural communication at the Annenberg School at the University of Southern California, where he has at least 400 students. He's a director of the Popular Music Project at USC, and he's the co-founder of the Edelson Society for Musical Preservation. Along the way, he happened to become a MacArthur Fellow, colloquially known as the Genius Award, in 2016, among many other prestigious honors. So this is a very incomplete resume, actually, but it speaks to the ease with which Josh moves within, between, and among textual, musical, and cultural spaces, from elite halls of academia to popular dance halls like Los Globos. I know you've been there
I have.
in Los Angeles. And this is all the more significant when one gets into the thick of the issues that he explores and how Josh uses music as a model for cultural analysis and proposes it as an experiential site for change. And Josh's work dives really deep into the aesthetics of cultural collisions, using investigations of sonic structures to unmask and unpeel the cross-cultural roots of music culture that have been hidden by history and social injustice. So in reading and listening to and watching Josh's work, I have come to see demonstrated before my eyes and ears the way his interdisciplinary approach to writing and to histories can also pose avenues of possibility when we think about social justice. So I hope we'll get to social justice
Absolutely.
in this conversation, but I'd love to start with you as an author. You're
Sure.
clearly a music buff. You were a mad vinyl collector at an early age, and how did you get into writing and decide not to be a musician? Because you clearly love music so
I
much.
do. How do you not become a musician? Well,
Yeah,
you find out
yeah.
you're not very good at it. It's a really complicated story. I just sucked. And so I did the next best thing, which was surround myself with it from a very, very early age. I grew up in a very musical household where my father seemed to always have at least one record by the Weavers playing at all times. And listening to the Weavers growing up in West Los Angeles in a kind of secular, progressive, left Jewish community was a profound entry point for me into what music is supposed to do. And I'm talking, when I was in fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade, that the Weavers taught me, which was that music is all about community. Music comes in all different languages, travels around the world, and it's always political and always risky. And as we all know, this is a group that did all those things and also got into big trouble, was blacklisted for their work. And so always I saw the connection between entertainment and the joy that music brings people, but also the real political risks that musicians can take and have always taken. And so I grew up listening, and I lucked out that I actually grew up on the same street as somebody who at the time was working at a talent agency in Los Angeles, and was part of the early founders of the Lollapalooza Festival, way, way, way back. And he had an incredible record collection. And he was so kind to me that he basically told his family that anytime I wanted to come by after school, I can just go and borrow his records and take them home and bootleg them and tape them. So that was also a great lesson that, like, the industry people were saying, just steal stuff. But it created this organic relationship that I had to kind of archival listening that really shaped the way I think I do what I do. And early on, he said to me, because I started interning for him, and I thought maybe I won't be a musician, but maybe I'll go into the music industry, which is like the logical place for a Jewish kid from LA to go who loves music. And he said, you love music too much, don't do it. Huh. And at an early age, it put that connection to me that of the tension between the industry of culture and culture, the industry of music and music. Not saying that they can't be done with beautiful synergy, but it made me think, oh, maybe I want to continue on the route of thinking about music and writing about it. So my first column first time I ever wrote about music was in 8th grade at my high school. I wrote a music column that had an amazing title, which I wish, if anyone wants to give me a new column, it was called Kun's Tunes, which I think will really work down the road. So, but it lasted. I wrote that column throughout high school, and basically have always been writing about music as a journalist or as a critic at the same time that I started studying it as a scholar.
And so, what I love about your writing and the many different ways that you tell a story. So you have the criticism sort of taking a part of, is this good? Is this the value of a song, the value of music? But then you do these cultural analysis in very sort of academic formats. You do these super close readings of songs. You do really richly illustrated essays. You have oral histories. You do exhibitions. You do music interventions in public space.
You know my work far better than I do.
It's
very good.
Yeah, no, it's
I'm like,
good.
when did I do
it's
that?
good.
Yeah.
But you've become really known for a signature way of making your argument, which is talking woven into a DJ soundtrack, where you're super comfortable talking with music going behind, and there's a kind of co-authorship happening in that way of telling your story and your narrative. I'd love to just hear how you felt like that was a good way to get into writing or telling stories.
I made a transition from being someone who strictly writes about music with critical distance, which was a big part of my work as a journalist, to starting to figure out how to do musical collaborations, and how, as a critic and as a scholar and as a writer, what I would learn from not just writing about a musician from afar, and with the safety as a critic of that distance, where one is not necessarily accountable for what one says about a musician, to actually talking about it live with them on stage. And so I started collaborating with bands and started collaborating with musicians, and increasingly now, if I'm asked to give lectures at a university, let's say, I'll often say, nah, I'll come, but I want you to bring this band with me, or bring this group of musicians, and we're going to do a musical lecture where I'm talking and they're playing and they're riffing off of me and I'm riffing off of them. And it really started with a band in LA called Ozomatli that some of you might know, who I was writing about as a music critic. If you don't know them, they will soon be on the Palm Springs circuit. So they'll be at Pachanga very soon. Just give them like 10 more years. They'd kill me for saying that. And I wrote about them as a critic for many, many, many years. And they were asked, I don't even know what year this was now, but were asked to give a TED Talk as a band. And they called me and said, we got asked to give a TED Talk. This is really exciting. And I said, it is. Congratulations. And they said, the problem is we don't know how to talk. So will you do the talk? And we ended up rehearsing this performance that was my critical reading of their history. They're a band of musicians, Latino and African American and Asian American artists who grew up in Los Angeles, formed out of the kind of the ashes of the '92 uprisings in Los Angeles, and have always used a very joyous mixture of Latin American music and African American music to address social inequities and civic unrest. And we wrote this piece together. And it was my first time where musicians were giving me feedback on my writing, and I was giving them feedback on what they were playing, and it was a 20-minute set. And that was it. I was hooked. And so I've been wanting to do that ever since. And the project the book I'm writing right now, which I'll talk about tomorrow, about music and the contemporary kind of scene of forced migration and refugee crises around the world, I've been developing with refugee artists who I've been just now starting to give lectures with them, playing with me on stage. And it changes the way that I think and write.
And you're super generous as an author. I mean, to be able to really have a co-authorship going into that. I mean, it's just something that you don't see a lot, and so that's.
It requires a lot of. It puts the things that I teach about and theorize about into practice. So I and pretty much anybody who writes about music and the power of music always writes about music as a platform of relationality, to use a phrase that I like a lot. Which is to say that every time we listen, any of us listen to music, no matter if it's songs we've heard thousands of times or brand new music, somebody else's body, somebody else's breath, somebody else's spirit, somebody else's story enters our bodies. And those sounds become how we define ourselves. Like, this is who I am, that is built on the sonic body of somebody else, be it Sinatra or Aretha Franklin or whoever it is. That person has taken up a kind of residence in our bodies. And as a result, I think we always talk about music as having all this possibility for connection, that we're bridging gaps in everyday life in terms of our everyday conversations or hanging out or sociality can be very difficult. We're actually doing it every day when we listen to music. We're engaging with difference, we're engaging with the other, we're engaging with people who aren't us every time those voices enter our bodies. And now I got good at writing about that and good at talking about it, but then I thought, okay, I need to actually do this and play it out. And so every time I speak with musicians, I learned so much from them about how they listen to each other. And like, we did a project you mentioned it, with SF MoMA 2 years ago. There was a project with SF MoMA and the San Francisco Public Library System where they asked a small group of artists to come together to use a partnership with the San Francisco Public Library to address any variety of contemporary social issues and crises in contemporary San Francisco. And for those who follow what's going on in San Francisco, mass gentrification and incredibly intense and often incredibly violent transformations of the urban landscape have forcibly removed large communities of color who have been long part of the central narrative of San Francisco out of the city. And the city has been really struggling with gentrification and the remaking of that city. So we did a project where I took old sheet music about San Francisco, songs about San Francisco from the late 1800s, and asked a group of musicians who'd never met before, from all different genres and backgrounds, if they would agree to come together at public library branches across San Francisco, and in front of an audience just like this, I would, on the spot, plop down a piece of sheet music from the 19th century. And the show was watching them figure out what to do. And so the goal was not for them to play the song. It was what we were learning was, how do you rehearse? And how do you get to know each other? How do you figure out when to solo, when to lay back, who's going to be the leader in this part and that part? And some of the performances, nothing happened. And we just watched 5 different individuals try to figure out how to create something in common. And that became a metaphor in the project for rehearsing a song as rehearsing a new city. Right? How can you use music, how can you use other art forms as ways of rethinking social behavior and social action? And that's where a lot of my work is right now.
So music is a model for social justice and action. You've written that music can be understood as congealed histories. And I mean, I think that's what that sheet music kind of is, a kind of congealed history. It's ripe for breaking apart. And you propose a kind of sonic analysis called the crossfade.
Yeah.
Which
I know is what drew all of you here.
What is
I thought if there's ever a demographic for the hip hop crossfade, Rancho Mirage, baby. But you're here. Beautiful. So the art of the crossfade. the crossfade is, when I started DJing at a very young age, I DJ'd my high school dances and parties and things, and like all beginner level DJs, had a really great small Radio Shack DJ mixer that, you know the feeling, that had, like most traditional DJ mixers, had two vertical faders and one horizontal fader. And the two vertical faders is usually where you put whatever song is playing that you're dancing to now, and you're queuing up in your ear the other song that's playing in your ear that you're then going to mix in. You'll hear this on the radio. But the crossfader, the horizontal fader, is the one that allows the DJ to move between whatever song is on the left channel to whatever song is on the right channel, moving back and forth between them to create a mix, right? And we've all, no matter when or where, have been in that situation where we hear a DJ, whether it's on the radio or at a restaurant or at a club, move between a song that they're playing to another song, and it's not a good mix, right? A good DJ knows enough about the granular details of the song that he or she is playing to know when to connect it and how to connect it to a song that's totally different. So, for example, if you have a Frank Sinatra track playing on input 1, and you're getting ready to play a song by Drake on input 2. And I use them because Drake will soon be the Sinatra of his generation, right? And they share a lot in common in many ways, I would argue. And so musically, how do you connect Frank Sinatra to Drake? You would think that's impossible, and that would be a really ugly mix, right? But the goal of the DJ is to say, what is that one part in the Sinatra song? Maybe it's a little horn part. Maybe it's a little trumpet. Maybe it's a particular part of the arrangement of the big band that he's playing with at the time. That moment might be actually a moment that Drake has sampled in one of his songs. Or maybe there is a melodic turn in the Drake song, or the same notes that of the similar sounding trumpet in the other song that the DJ says, okay, my audience loves Sinatra. I'm going to get them to love Drake, even though they've never heard Drake before. And what's going to be the way I do it? I'm going to find the point of connection that allows these totally different individuals to not only speak to each other in common, but then produce something new together. And so for me, the crossfader is a really great way to think about the challenges around social identity, diversity, and difference. It's in a way the opposite of the dominant narrative of racial and ethnic identity in the United States, the melting pot, which we've inherited for so long, as the emblem of multiculturalism and diversity, the great melting pot of the United States. And in fact, it's just not true. The melting pot was never about diversity at all. We've been fed a melting pot of misinformation. The melting pot was about melting into a singular American race, where diversity goes to emerge into a singular figure. And the melting pot itself actually came from music. It came from a play by the British Jewish immigrant playwright Israel Zangwill, who wrote a play about a immigrant Jewish composer who was composing the Great Symphony of America. And he said, listen, it's the great melting pot of America. And it was going to be a singular American sound with a singular American race. The crossfade is the opposite. It's not about the melt, it's about the mix. Because what a crossfade does, it allows you to sustain difference while mixing. So you get difference coming together and converging, and the goal of the DJ is how do you keep two totally different things at play at the same time, in the same mix, mixing them together while preserving difference. And to me, it's been a really useful way to think about both the issues of diversity and difference in the United States and abroad, but certainly also just about how we all do the work we do in our various organizations, whether you run a foundation or if you run a synagogue or you run a library, right? How do you juggle inputs? How do you value difference while asking difference to be in dialogue with itself and with each other? So I've started using that in my teaching. I've started using it in my writing. I talk about it with DJs. We have a short film you can see that was also part of a TEDx conference that I did with Jay Period. He's a wonderful hip-hop DJ based in New York. And he DJs while I talk about the crossfade theory. And we're trying now to develop that out into a curricular series where we're using the crossfade in classrooms to basically bring this idea and bring this message to young people, and et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense? All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't fishing. But it's a tricky concept, so I just want to make sure we got it.
Yeah. So what's really great as someone who, I also went through academic halls, and I wrote about experience. I wrote about sensory
Yeah.
experience. And the hard thing is, how do you find a way to live the argument, or just perform it? And I think you're getting to something that's really multisensory, super interdisciplinary, and experiential, that you can understand the argument by using your ears. We're so often encouraged to read to understand. But what you're proposing is that, well, actually, we have everything we need. We just need to be maybe better listeners. And so, actually, I was wondering, how do you connect? You do some really beautiful song analysis in your writing, where you really kind of go back to these points of influence in history and time. And I love you breaking down Richie Valens' La Bamba as having like the secret cha-cha history. And I guess can we? And then I love the quotes you use that are like Bob Dylan's "Don't fear that foreign sound in your ear." Music as experience. Can you talk a little bit about how you connect listening to reading, or how we can be maybe thinking about doing close readings, and how we can think about doing close listening, how we might apply how we have learned to read into how we listen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have two answers to it. One would be that, like in my classes at USC, that's exactly what I teach, which is, for those of us who teach and think about popular music, there's a commonplace idea, which is that I could walk into a room of 200 undergraduate students and give them a lecture on the early writings of Freud, and I could make up everything. And most of them would write it down and, to a certain degree, just say, okay, sure, okay, yeah, that's it. You want me to tell you that back, and I'll get an A. If I got up there and gave them a lecture where I argued that Mariah Carey is actually more valuable as a musical icon than Beyonce, they're going to argue with me for the full hour and a half, because it's knowledge that they have themselves lived and thought about, whether they were living it and thinking about it in the ways that I'm asking them to. But one of the things that we do with popular music is that these are songs that, again, are so much part of our lives, that they're, as they were for me growing up, they're the ways we understand the world. It's a contact point, right? And for better or worse, some of the first things I learned about the world were through the things that musicians sang about. It's not always the best way to learn, the way to learn everything, but it's incredibly helpful, and it's a knowledge that we all already have.
It's embodied knowledge.
It's embodied, but also we're comfortable talking about it. We talk about our favorite movies, we talk about our favorite artists. If we go and pay $100 to see somebody sing at a show, it's because we have a relationship and we want to be moved. We want to relive an experience we had with that song in another context, whatever it is, super intimate, but also super social at the same time. And so for me, listening to songs and listening to them with a critical ear, I mean, the greatest compliment that I get from my undergraduate students is that I've ruined their favorite music, because they're thinking very hard and critically about things that they just were loving uncritically. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to do, is to say, like, oh, I didn't know that that's where that song came from, or where that melody came from, or, ooh, I didn't actually know that that's what that lyric meant, and didn't understand the cultural context or political context of a song. But in terms of the writing part, which I wanted to respond to a little, because I'm thinking about it a lot, like right now, like this week, and I'm feeling very confessional because I'm back in the homeland, that my grandparents lived here for 40 years. So I love the desert and Palm Springs and feel very myself when I'm here. So is that the more that I'm talking about music with musicians, I have to say the harder it's become to write. And I've been really struggling lately, because the more that I'm developing my ideas live on a stage with musicians, the thing that I'll get from the audience is, that was amazing. How are you going to write that down? How are you going to translate that feeling onto the page? And that's been the real a new challenge in my writing career, is to say, all right, I've got to really now think differently about Because it's one thing to write about a song that exists and try to embody that feeling in your writing. I feel like I've worked at that
You're really good at that.
my whole
Josh is
career.
really good at that.
Well, but I'm
Yeah.
still working on it, right? But it's another thing where the knowledge about the song only exists because it's been done through the music. That then how do you communicate that? That's where I'm now having my little writer struggle right now with this new project, is how to actually translate the talking and the playing onto the page so the page sings. And that's a good challenge.
So the author's challenge. There's a certain ethical consideration as an author uh, in writing about cultures that are not our own.
Yeah.
And yeah, how have you situated your own identity in your work? How do you experience your whiteness when you're talking about Latinx music? You described yourself as a stranger among sounds, or Kafka's dog. I mean, can we talk a little bit? Can I get
Sure.
that's my prodding question. That's the
Oh,
only
no,
hard.
that's a really
Yeah,
great
yeah.
question. So it's tricky terrain that I take very seriously and have thought about my whole career in different ways going forward. On the one hand, I had a mentor early on who also wrote about music in ways very similar to what I did, and I think it was early on in my career where I had gotten some criticism. What's this white dude writing about Chicano music, right? Writing about Mexican music, and it really messed me up because I thought I was writing about it from a really from a side of advocacy, which I believe I am, and a side of deep understanding, and had gotten great support from various Mexican communities around the work I was doing. But it was like one stray comment that gets you and makes you think. And I asked him about it, and he said, well, you know, if you're not supposed to write if you're not supposed to write about things that are different than you are, um, it doesn't bode well for scientists studying insects. And I thought, well, it's not the same, but that point was important to me. So I've approached it with a sense of deep positionality, where there's nothing in my work, not a single book I've ever written or a single piece that I've written, where you don't get a sense of overtly or kind of through the side of who I am writing it. And sometimes that's earned me some really great Amazon comments. Like, why does he always talk about himself? I talk about myself in writing about the work that I do because it's important that my positionality is front and center, so that people know that I grew up in Los Angeles, that I grew up in a white Jewish family, that these are my politics. This is where I'm from. This is when I walk into a room of Mexican migrant musicians, as I do often. I walk in with this body and with the history that this body carries, right? And it's the history that they're relating to at the same time. And if I can't talk through that, then I'm failing. And I think increasingly now in this super contemporary political climate and moment, owning that positionality and owning that privilege is, if I don't do that, it's not working. And also, so how do I experience my whiteness? Um, you know, Writing about the whiteness of the American Jew is something that I've done in a lot of my earlier work, and have always been interested in the way of the often tense relationship that Jewishness and whiteness have had in the United States, very different over different moments in time. And that's been a really important source for me to think about myself and to think about my own history. And it's interesting, I mean, most of my work has been based in LA and Southern California. And last year, I spent a big chunk of the year in Berlin on a fellowship and was starting to do research around music and migration in contemporary Europe. And it was a very different experience where I was in Europe as a white person, but whose connection to that history from a family of Hungarian Jews and Greek Jews who both died and survived Auschwitz, and who had family in the DP camps of Germany. I was interviewing a really great hip hop crew of African immigrant hip hop artists in Berlin, and I said something like, "Oh man, I love Berlin. I don't want to leave." And one of them looked at me. He's like, "It's because you're white, man. That's why you love it here." And I was like, "You're right, but I wasn't. 4 decades ago, I wasn't white here." And it produced a really good conversation about the shifting contours of racial identity and racial visibility. So long story, long way to answer that owning the position out, owning my positionality, that's where I start. I mean, I come on the academic side, you know, I'm a student of Antonio Gramsci and his writings around culture and revolution and change. And he said very, very upfront in an excerpt from his notebooks from prison that to have critical consciousness about the world, which is what you need to change the world, you first have to have critical consciousness about yourself. You have to know your own position, how you became this political and social entity before you can talk about it in any other context. And so I try to do that in everything I do.
And I love that in this incredible research you do, you're able to find this opportunity to get into this stuff with archival materials and working with libraries. And you've produced these really wonderful books, To Live and Dine in LA, with menus, restaurant menus throughout the 20th century, telling the story of Los Angeles by thinking about the food that people ate and the way that menus appeared and how people read them as a way into a culture. Can you talk a little bit about your work with archives or how you find these treasures?
Absolutely. Most of my life was dealing with informal archives, so that's my natural place to go. People's collections or stuff you have or garage sales or swap meets, and then amassing my own archives that are not official or formal. But and as a result, about 5 years ago, the president of the Library Foundation of Los Angeles, Ken Brecker, asked me if I'd be interested in coming in to see what the archives and special collections were around music at Central Library in downtown LA, and if there'd be something that I would want to work on with my students. And then he called me back and he said, I feel terrible. We actually don't have a music collection. And he said, the only thing we have is sheet music, and you wouldn't be interested in that. And I said, oh, really? And they have 100,000 pieces of sheet music and songbooks. And among that sheet music and among those songbooks, my students and I just started going through it just to see what was there. And we went alphabetically, and we're in the A's, and we start seeing all these songs about angels, Angel Town, Angel City, Angel, 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 and they're all songs about Los Angeles from the late 1800s up through the 1930s, 1940s. And light bulb went on. Let's create an archive of Los Angeles songs based on this collection. So we spent about a year going through 100,000 pieces of sheet music and creating the first sheet music archive of Los Angeles. That is now you can go visit and use at the library. But then decided it can't just be that, and so I took some of that sheet music and I asked a group of contemporary musicians in LA if they would go into a recording studio who donated their time to the project and record those songs for the first time in many cases. And we made short documentaries with KCET Artbound about the process of bringing the archive to life, animating the archive. So a big part of that process for me was about how, not the special, I'm interested in special collections, but I want to despecialize them. So how do you take the things that are in the rare book room and make them useful again? How do you recirculate so that these texts from the 1800s, from the early 1900s, go back into circulation and get new meaning? And that project led to, we did a bunch of concerts where we brought those songs to life. And then it led to the menu project, which was about 30,000 restaurant menus that the library has, lots of LA menus. And this was a no-brainer because everybody was, this is right when LA's foodie scene was like apexing. And but also, I have to say, right when LA's food insecurity was at its highest number. So when we started that project in 2015, LA County was the most food insecure county in the United States. USDA called it the epicenter of hunger in the United States. 85% of students in LAUSD schools come from food insecure homes. So how are we going to do a book about restaurant menus, which by definition are texts of privilege? By definition. I don't care how inexpensive the menu is. It's never been a given that people go out to dinner. That is a relatively new idea. And it's something that still is very much an act of privilege. And so how are we going to talk about, particularly if people are going to go down memory lane about, oh, when I was at the Brown Derby, which is wonderful. But how do you do that in a city where that many people are just not eating. And not even to talk about the homeless population of Los Angeles. And so that's how we rethought that project, was instead of it being a nostalgia project about the good old days of restaurants, bygone restaurants, how can restaurant menus be used as social text to understand the evolution of food inequality and equality in Los Angeles, but also the evolution of kind of the growth of migrant communities in Los Angeles, the history of African American owned restaurants in Los Angeles, the history of racism in restaurants in Los Angeles, but also the history of social justice meetings and protests that happened in restaurants in Los Angeles. And a lot of this was because I teamed up early on with a guy named Roy Choi, a really wonderful chef. Some of you might know his restaurants and the Kogi truck. He was one of the architects of the food truck revolution. And this is right before Roy got super famous, which was allowed us to hang out at that time. And he came into the library, and I remember we pulled the library early on in the project. The librarians pulled out of the most beautiful menus from the 1800s, the earliest menus, not from restaurants, because there were no restaurant menus at that time, and there weren't many restaurants in Los Angeles, but there were banquets. Banquets at the Jonathan Club, Chamber of Commerce banquets, really beautiful Thanksgiving meals, New Year's Eve dinners, gorgeous menus. And the librarians bring it out, and they're beaming with pride, and I'm beaming with pride, and we're all excited, and here comes Roy. He's gonna be my spirit guide, and I was like, what do you think? And he's just looking at it, dead silent. He just looks at me, and he's like, that's cool. Where'd everybody else eat? And that question, where did everybody else eat, became the question for the project. And so every menu, even if it was a banquet menu, it meant, okay, that existed, what else was going on at the same time? And so a big lesson I've learned with these archival projects, and we're in the middle of our third one now, is when you are dealing with an archive, really what you're dealing with is what's not there. It's as much about what's in front of you as what's not in front of you. And that's been the hardest thing to do, is because you have thousands and thousands of things in front of you, and really all you obsess over is, what's not here? Where's the document of this? Why didn't this person collect that? Why didn't the library collect that? Is it because it doesn't exist? Or because no one thought it had value? Or because no one had the wherewithal to save when a parent passes or a grandparent goes, to say, that box full of menus, that box full of sheet music, or that box full of records, that matters. And lots of people have different approaches and relationships to stuff and its value. And so I think getting comfortable with what's missing has been a really important part of this project.
Yeah, and historically, our cultural institutions, our museums, our libraries, the things we save, there's always something missing. As you continue to collect, there's always something missing. And that's why writing's so important. I mean, in this beautiful volume, which is incredibly seductive because of these incredible visuals, you always have great texts embedded within. So you're looking at the images, and then you're reading these histories. And, I think this research really underscores how important it is to continue writing. So thanks.
Cool.
Thanks
well, the one we're doing now, which is very much related to this, is a collection of autographs that the LA Public Library has. An autograph collection started in 1905 by then State Librarian Charles Lummis. And Charles Lummis was concerned that LA and the LA Public Library was not going to have any fame or renown, because LA was a small town, and who cared about the LA Public Library? So he went through the Who's Who directory of the United States in 1905, and he sent blank stationery to every single person in the Who's Who directory of the United States. And he said, would you please improve upon this page? And he created this non-existent archive of autographs, beautiful stationery, and people sent back not just their signatures, but watercolors, poems, speeches. And that collection grew for many decades, so that they started getting autographs from Helen Keller and Langston Hughes and Frank L. Baum and all these wonderful people. So we started that collection again, but flipped it. And so we had an open autograph day across Los Angeles last year, where not just the people who count or the who's who, but the entire city was invited to leave their mark on the autograph collection. And so the book became became a way of using this autograph collection to open up a much bigger conversation about whose voices are remembered in a city's history, how do everyday people leave their mark on the city, whether it's an autograph, whether it's a naming opportunity in a building or a library, or in a graffiti tag on a wall. These are all related gestures about naming and power and being remembered once we're gone.
That's really good. So I know you have a deep relationship to the desert. Your family had a home out here. You found some kind of spiritual awakening in 29 Palms when you were making your dissertation into a book.
It's true.
And we have some really incredible modernist histories here in the desert, which I know you've investigated a bit in your work. I'd love to hear your take on desert modernism, or how you might intervene in this history or approach it as a subject. Have you spent some time in any archives out here, or?
Well, I'm a little nervous about critiquing the most important industry in Palm Springs, especially when it's one I'd love to be invited to Desert Modernism Week. Look, I think I've been very, so I grew, my grandparents lived here, and I spent many, many weekends here, and they lived in a desert modern home, and I was very aware of that culture and that world that meant a lot to me emotionally and personally. But at the same time that my critical consciousness as a scholar and as a writer was evolving and growing in graduate school and beyond, it made me look at Palm Springs with a different set of eyes. And so on the one hand, I was loving and wanting to learn about the world that my grandparents lived in here, which was a world connected, I should say, not to the film industry per se in Los Angeles. My grandfather owned a very small men's clothing store in Inglewood, where some of his clients were Jewish comics. And as a result, he got kind of guest membership at the Friars Club and could play cards with some of the great comics and stuff. So he was in and out, right? But I was very comfortable with that world. And yet at the same time, I realized that, well, that's not Palm Springs. And that's not all of Palm Springs, right? It doesn't get to all of the complexities and layers. So I started writing about that other Palm Springs, and I used my grandparents' story as a way to challenge myself about what else that I didn't know about this place. So I started learning about Section 14. I started learning about Lawrence Crosley, the African-American architect who designed all the first golf courses in Palm Springs. I had an undergraduate student early on at USC who's a Mexican-American immigrant student whose family cleaned homes and still cleans homes throughout Los Angeles. And he and I had this, we were talking about this yesterday, he and I had this really intense moment early on when he said, I'm from Palm Springs. And I said, I love Palm Springs. And then we realized that, he said to me, probably my mother could have been your grandmother's housekeeper. And that conversation was incredibly important for understanding what desert modernism, for all of its architectural importance and aesthetic importance, covers up. And I think that there are still really important conversations to have in this area where you're talking about, like when Coachella hits, right? Something my students hate me for saying this every year, but they go to Coachella, and I was like, you need to know the history of Coachella. You need to know the history of the land that you are partying on top of, right? This is migrant farm land. This is a Mexican migrant community. This region this is a heavily Latino migrant community that coexists and often feeds the world of the desert modern and the desert postmodern. That's not a critique of one or a celebration of the either. It's the simultaneity of these worlds that are together. So I'm always interested in new conversations that are investigating the aesthetic histories of desert modernism within the contemporary urgencies of immigrant, non-minority majority California.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you.
For your incredible insight.
30 seconds to go.
Good. Yeah.